Welcome to this rapid revision video looking at Elizabethan leisure and entertainment. We'll be covering everything from sport to fun to theatre, so let's get into it. Leisure time, haves and have-nots. Like virtually everything in Tudor society, what sports, leisure and entertainment you could join in with largely depended on social class. While the poor had to work almost every hour of daylight there was, with little time for leisure, the rich often had ample opportunity for exercise and cultural enrichment. This video we will consider leisure time for different classes of people, divided between sports and entertainment. Sports might include gambling and blood sports too, and entertainment includes theatre, music and dance. The nobility had a variety of sports they could do. Many sports for the nobility were rooted in a tradition of military skills. These included hunting, often on horseback with hounds, spears and bows. The comparison with warfare might be fairly obvious. Both men and women were keen hunters though. Fencing. This was sword fighting essentially. This was a way for men to practice sword fighting skills. Wrestling. This was between men and it tested strength. Other sports were more for exercise and for recreation rather than training. Hawking, which was also popular with both men and women. Keeping and flying birds of prey was the strict preserve of the nobility. Fishing. This also entertained men and women, more for sport than for the table, you understand. There could be harsh punishments for poor people poaching from the rivers. And real tennis. While this does include rackets, balls and a net, it bears very little relation to modern or lawn tennis, as we're about to see. This picture shows a tennis court, a real or royal tennis court. Some things might well be familiar. We can see the rackets that they're playing with, although they're smaller and rather stiffer than the ones that would be used today. Also, there is a net in the middle, acting as an obstacle. But you'll notice there are more players than we'd be used to today, 3 on each side. There's a target on the back wall. This can be hit to score points. Also, any part of the court can be used. The viewing gallery here, well, that's not out of bounds, that's fair play. A skillful player might be able to roll the ball along the top of this roof, and then an equally skilled one might be able to bat it back when it drops down. The thing is, the balls they were using were nothing like as bouncy as the ones that we have today. They were much harder, and they'd really hurt if they hit you. However, the basics of modern day tennis are essentially there. This would only be playable in specially built tennis courts like the ones shown here though, and so again, really, this is the preserve of the nobility. What about sport for working people? Many sports for working people were far rougher and more violent than sports enjoyed by the nobility. Take wrestling for example. Wrestling was not just for the nobility, like this picture here from Field of Cloth of Gold showing Henry VIII wrestling with King Francis of France. Working men were also keen wrestlers, with matches often taking place in public and people often betting on the outcome. Football was also an immensely popular sport with entire communities, but the football of Elizabeth's time would be unrecognisable to us. There were no rules. The goals could be anything from a church door to the entrance of whole streets. There could be hundreds of people to a team. The ball could be kicked, thrown, carried, and the opponents could use violence to tackle you. Each match could last many hours. It wasn't unknown for men to be killed during football matches. To give a sense of what Elizabethan football was like, we do have a modern survivor, the Atherstone ball game. Here we can see that there's a massive mob of people, and it looks like they're all men, and they're all fighting over getting this leather ball. It's not even clear who's on which team, but people would have had a broad idea as to which end of town they're trying to get the ball. There's one street is the goal in the Atherstone ball game, and there's another street which serves as the opposing goal. Although there are rules against deliberately assaulting people, it can get pretty rough. You can see a man being basically picked up by his neck here, and people do it very much at their own risk. If you look closely, there are even shops which are boarded up in the background because they're expecting it to get so rowdy. It's no wonder then that football in medieval times and later in Elizabeth's times was often frowned upon by the nobility as a rough and uncouth sport. It wasn't always about taking part. As well as watching some of the sports already described, there were some sports that Elizabethans watched for fun and often to gamble on. We call these spectator sports. Some of these were blood sports that might seem pretty shocking to us today. One example might be baiting. This sport involves setting up a fight between specially bred fighting dogs and a large animal, typically a bear or a bull. So, for example, modern-day bulldogs, they tend to be descended from the dogs which were bred for bullfighting. The bear was usually too expensive to let die, but at the same time its teeth were shortened to even up the fight. But people would still gamble on the outcome of the fight nonetheless. Almost every town had a bear or bull ring, and sometimes this is actually preserved in modern town and pub names. Almost everyone, from paupers to the Queen herself, would have watched this so-called sport. Bull baiting was usually to their death, on the other hand, either the bull or the bulldogs coming out as the so-called winner. Another would be cockfighting. This is where two cockerels were pitted against each other, typically in a fight to the death. Large sums of money might change hands in bets on the outcome. A variant known as cock throwing, which is pictured here, involved throwing heavy sticks at a tied down bird until it died. Fun, huh? The winner, or as far as you can win a game like that, being the person who threw the fatal stick. This source shows a typical bull ring, where you can see the bull bearing its horns at the fighting dogs. You can see the owners setting the dogs on there as well. People by this point would have already made their bets. Here we can see large numbers of people are watching. So this was truly a popular spectator sport. Let's move on to something a bit more civilised. Early Elizabethan theatre. Literature developed in terms of both quantity and type during Elizabeth's reign as literacy increased. Histories and earlier works such as Chaucer's Canterbury Tales remained popular. Poetry, both reading and writing, was a popular pastime with the educated gentry and nobility. Even Elizabeth wrote poetry for pleasure. However, as Elizabeth's reign continued, theatre became increasingly secular, this means non-religious, and there are good reasons for this. Older types of drama, such as mystery plays, which are more about religious mystery than, say, a whodunit, were religious in theme. Another common one was the mummers play. We can see a picture of that, where you had recurring characters who would still be in a broadly biblical story. As the Reformation continued, people increasingly saw theatre like this as simply being a way of keeping Catholic traditions alive. Some people probably liked that, but a lot didn't. During Elizabeth's reign and into the Stuart period, there were huge developments in theatre, many of which we recognise today. Aside from doubts over Catholic themes in mystery plays, the other problem was that there was very little, mystery. People tended to know how Bible stories ended before they saw the play. Secular or non-religious theatre was more varied and exciting. Tudor humour was also surprisingly filthy, not appropriate for religious plays. It was fashionable to be seen at the theatre. The expensive seats at the theatre were not those that had the best view, but the ones where you could be seen. Members of the nobility would sponsor groups of actors to provide them with entertainment, but also to show the masses how culturally sophisticated they were. The Duke of Leicester sponsored the Leicester's Men and Elizabeth the Queen's Men, and these groups became famous. Note that at this time, all the actors were male, including boys playing the female characters. I've managed to get this far talking about Elizabethan theatre without mentioning the name Shakespeare. But of course, no discussion of Elizabethan theatre can be complete without mentioning William Shakespeare. We're going to have a look at Shakespeare's Globe here. This is an artist's reconstruction of it, and it helps to actually tell us quite a lot about how Elizabethan theatre was structured. You can see the groundlings down here. They've probably got the best view in the house. They would have also paid the least to get in. And yes, they do have to stand throughout the play. One of the reasons why Shakespeare's plays are also in many acts, because there'll be lots of intervals for people to nip off to the loo, go to the bar, or get something to eat. We can also see people who've paid a little bit more money. These gallery seats here don't necessarily have a better view. There's often, say, a pillar in the way of the stage, or the roof of the stage might cover it up slightly, but they're much more visible. We can also see the actors on the stage with their various costumes, and a backstage area for them to get change, and then for them to swap over props, etc. And we can see at the top there a space for musicians, and even special effects. We know, for example, from Shakespeare's scripts that there were calls for alarm bells to be rung, and cannons to be fired, for example. We know that Elizabethan theatres also sometimes burned down when the gunpowder caught light to the thatch. But we also get other clues too. We can see the actors preparing to come on backstage, preparing their props, preparing basic sets, and various other things that are necessary for the theatre, which people would probably pretty much recognise today. This is a short excerpt from one of Shakespeare's plays. In fact, it's very much abridged. I've skipped a little bit in the middle, but it'll help make the point. Surviving Elizabethan plays can actually tell us quite a bit about how theatres were structured and what people's expectations were. This is the opening few lines from Shakespeare's play Henry V, so it's Act 1, Scene 1. I used to be an actor, so I'm going to see if I can do this justice. Probably not, but here goes. Oh, for a muse of fire that would ascend the brightest heaven of invention, a kingdom for a stage, princes to act, and monarchs to behold the swelling scene. Can this cockpit hold the vasty fields of France? Or may we cram within this wooden O the very casks that did affright the air at Agincourt? Well, what does this tell us about Elizabethan theatre? Well, firstly, the chorus part here has described the theatre as a cockpit. This is a little bit of a self-deprecating joke because the Elizabethan theatre was so much grander than a cockpit where you would see a cockfight going on, for example. But that's Shakespeare having a little bit of a joke and being a bit self-deprecating. He also refers to it as a wooden O, this idea of it being a circular building, which had been virtually unique in Elizabethan London at the time. The part of the chorus in Shakespeare's Henry V basically spends the entire play apologising that all the sets are rubbish, all the accents are bad, that the horses aren't really there, and that these grand, amazing battles like the Battle of Agincourt are being recreated with maybe 5 or 6 people with fake swords. But it's getting the audience to understand that and getting them to use their imagination to fill in the blanks. And most people were more than willing to do so. And let's face it, whatever your view of Shakespeare, the plays remain tremendously popular to this day. There are therefore famous plays, famous theatre, and famous theatres. Purpose-built theatres began to appear in this period. The Rose was built in 1567, the Red Lion in 1587, and they were both built in London. But the most famous of all was the Globe, which was built in 1599, which is most associated with William Shakespeare. Popular play genres included comedies. These plays might have serious or dramatic elements, but generally they had silly or romantic themes, where everything turns all right in the end. E.g. Much Ado About Nothing, the title of which literally means there's been a lot going on, but it's all over nothing. Then we got tragedies. These plays were serious in theme, where the tragedy comes from the lead character losing everything through their own flaws. For example, Shakespeare's Macbeth. And then there are the histories. These are often based on classical works, or they might be based on what was then recent history. Accuracy was not as important as drama, and not upsetting the Queen, of course. For example, Shakespeare's Henry V. All classes enjoyed the theatre, and thousands queued for a chance to see the latest plays, especially in the towns. Standing in the pit provided the best view, and it only cost a penny. Seating was far more expensive, with the gentry and nobility paying vast sums, as we've said, to sit in seats where they would be visible to the audience too. We mustn't forget music and dance either. Elizabethans of all backgrounds loved music and dancing. Noble households had expensive instruments, some of which might look familiar today, like the guitar-like lutes. We can see a portrait of Elizabeth I playing one there, and piano-like harpsichords and spinets. They employed professional musicians for their entertainment. Lower classes enjoyed energetic pipes, bagpipes and fiddles, or violins as we might call them today. Public performances were common, and towns also employed musicians themselves. Music could be more informal too, with people enjoying a pint of ale and a sing-song in the taverns, hymns in church and in the streets. Printing allowed popular songworks to become bought more affordably, and some songs became famous across the country. Music was also written to accompany the theatre, allowing even more secular experimentation with music. It wasn't just about hymns anymore. Dance was popular as a way of meeting potential partners as well, though people of different classes would not be seen dead dancing together, of course. With our brief look at music and dancing out the way, let's consider this interpretation by historian Andrew Wilson, written in the Elizabethans, published in 2011. There were new schools, English ships sailed to new lands and brought back the sense of an expanded world. In churches, halls, palaces and country houses, new music delighted the ear. You could not be alive in Elizabethan England and not feel that it was a young country, full of capacity to reinvent itself. Elizabethans knew how to have fun. Sport was popular with all classes. The nobility enjoyed hunting, tennis and archery. The poor played violent football matches, and all enjoyed blood sports like bear and bull baiting. But also theatre was thriving, with new secular or non-religious plays, poetry and literature by genius playwrights like William Shakespeare being incredibly popular. People from all backgrounds loved going to the theatre, singing and dancing. The Reformation moved art and entertainment away from the church and into the hands of secular artists. Bearing this in mind, do these points and the other things that we found out today support the interpretation? Let me know by writing in the comments below. Perhaps you could also share which Shakespearean plays you've been forced to enjoy at school. And I do say enjoy rather than endure, because try and get over the language, and there's some really good stories there. Maybe I'm biased though, because I've performed in a few of them. Nevertheless, that's the end of this hopefully leisurely and entertaining episode of Rapid Revision. If it's been useful, please like the video and subscribe to the channel for more. Other than that, I'll say thanks very much for watching and adieu.